I'm John McKenzie. Well, I'm a collaborator or volunteer, whatever term you want to use, that I've been coming here for almost as long as the library has existed. I'll be reading from Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. Well, it's a great history. It is history. It is not a novel. It is history. I read it a number of years ago. What made me decide to read it for today, for this program, was when I discovered that Mitch Daniels, who was the governor of Indiana prior to Mike Pence, banned it from all the schools in Indiana when he was governor back in about 2010. And they also, in the 2010 era, they tried to ban it in Arkansas. There actually was a bill introduced a couple times in the Arkansas legislature to ban it, but it didn't pass, which makes me think more highly of Arkansas than I might have in the past. So I think I've explained a little bit why I chose this book, but I also think one thing that needs to be pointed out is that everybody has a point of view, and history is not just something that exists. It's something that is, when people are writing history or talking about history, they can't help but bring their point of view to it. And in the introduction to A People's History of the United States, it says, that is why he opens A People's History of the United States by stating his point of view very directly. This is quoting Howard Zinn. In that inevitable taking of sides which comes from selection and emphasis in history, I prefer to try to tell the story of the discovery of America from the viewpoint of the Arawaks, of the Constitution from the standpoint of the slaves, of Andrew Jackson as seen by the Cherokees, of the Civil War as seen by the New York Irish, of the Mexican War as seen by the deserting soldiers of Scott's army, of the rise of industrialism as seen by the young women in the Lowell textile mills, of the Spanish-American War as seen by the Cubans, the conquest of the Philippines as seen by black soldiers on Luzon, the Gilded Age as seen by Southern farmers, the First World War as seen by socialists, the Second World War as seen by pacifists, the New Deal as seen by blacks in Harlem, the post-war American empire is seen by peons in Latin America, and so on, to the limited extent that any one person, however he or she strains, can, quote, see, unquote, history from the standpoint of others. I'm going to read from the first and perhaps also the second chapter of the book. The first chapter is Columbus, the Indians, and Human Progress, and it deals with the first contact of whites from Europe coming to what we now call America. Arawak men and women, naked, tawny, and full of wonder, emerged from their villages onto the island's beaches and swam out to get a closer look at the strange big boat. When Columbus and his sailors came ashore, carrying swords, speaking oddly, the Arawaks ran to greet them, brought them food, water, gifts. He later wrote of this in his log, he being Columbus. They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawk's bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know them, for I showed them a sword. They took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. These Arawaks of the Bahama Islands were much like Indians on the mainland who were remarkable for their hospitality, their belief in sharing. These traits did not stand out in the Europe of the Renaissance, dominated as it was by the religion of popes, the government of kings, the frenzy for money that marked Western civilization, and its first messenger to the Americas, Christopher Columbus. Columbus wrote, "As soon as I arrived in the Indies, on the first island which I found, I took some of the natives by force in order that they might learn and might give me information of whatever there is in these parts." The information that Columbus wanted most was, where is the gold? He had persuaded the king and queen of Spain to finance an expedition to the lands. The wealth he expected to be on the other side of the Atlantic, the Indies and Asia, gold and spices. For like other informed people of his time, he knew that the world was round and he could sail west in order to get to the Far East. Spain was recently unified, one of the new modern nation states like France, England, and Portugal. Its population, mostly poor peasants, worked for the nobility, who were 2% of the population and owned 95% of the land. Spain had tied itself to the Catholic Church, expelled all the Jews, driven out the Moors. Like other states of the modern world, Spain sought gold, which was becoming the new mark of wealth, more useful than land because it could buy anything. There was gold in Asia, it was thought, and certainly silks and spices. For Marco Polo and others had brought back marvelous things from their overland expeditions centuries before. Now that the Turks had conquered Constantinople and the eastern Mediterranean and controlled the land routes to Asia, a sea route was needed. Portuguese sailors were working their way around the southern tip of Africa. Spain decided to gamble on a long sail across an unknown ocean. In return for bringing back gold and spices, they promised Columbus 10% of the profits, governorship over newfound lands, and the fame that would go with the new title, Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He was a merchant's clerk from the Italian city of Genoa, part-time weaver, the son of a skilled weaver, and expert sailor. He set out with 3 sailing ships, the largest of which was the Santa Maria, perhaps 100 feet long, and 39 crew members. Columbus would never have made it to Asia, which was thousands of miles farther away than he calculated, imagining a smaller world. He would have been doomed by that great expanse of sea. But he was lucky. 1/4 of the way there, he came upon an unknown, uncharted land that lay between Europe and Asia, the Americas. It was early October 1492, and 33 days since he and his crew had left the Canary Islands off the Atlantic coast of Africa. Now they saw branches and sticks floating in the water. They saw flocks of birds. These were signs of land. Then on October 12th, a sailor called Rodrigo saw the early morning moon shining on white sands and cried out. It was at an island in the Bahamas, the Caribbean Sea. The first man to sight land was supposed to get a yearly pension of 10,000 maravedis for life, but Rodrigo never got it. Columbus claimed he had seen a light the evening before. He got the reward. So approaching land, they were met by the Arawak Indians, who swam out to greet them. The Arawaks lived in village communities, had a developed agriculture of corn, yams, cassava. They could spin and weave, but they had no horses or work animals. They had no iron, but they wore tiny gold ornaments in their ears. This was to have enormous consequences. It led Columbus to take some of them aboard ship as prisoners because he insisted that they guide him to the source of the gold. He then sailed to what is now Cuba, then to Hispaniola, the island which today consists of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. There are bits of visible gold in the rivers and a gold mask presented to Columbus by a local Indian chief led to wild visions of gold fields. On Hispaniola, out of timbers from the Santa Maria, which had run aground, Columbus built a fort, the first European military base in the Western Hemisphere. He called it Navidad and left 39 crew members there with instructions to find and store the gold. He took more Indian prisoners and put them aboard his 2 remaining ships. At one part of the island, he got into a fight with Indians who refused to trade as many bows and arrows as he and his men wanted. 2 of them were run through with swords and bled to death. Then the Nina and Pinta set sail for the Azores in Spain. When the weather turned cold, the Indian prisoners began to die. Columbus's report to the court in Madrid was extravagant. He insisted he had reached Asia, it was Cuba, and an island off the coast of China, it was Hispaniola. His descriptions were part fact, part fictions. The Indians Columbus reported are so naive and so free with their possessions that no one who has not witnessed them would believe it. When you ask for something they have, they never say no. To the contrary, they offer to share with anyone. He concluded his report by asking for a little help from their majesties, and in return, he would bring them from his next voyage as much gold as they need and as many slaves as they ask. He was full of religious talk. Thus the eternal God, our Lord, gives victory to those who follow his way over apparent impossibilities. This chapter goes on to talk about how Columbus's next voyage, he was given 17 ships and more than 1,200 men. The aim was to bring back slaves and gold. They went from island to island in the Caribbean, taking Indians as captives. But as word spread of the Europeans' intent, they found more and more empty villages. On Haiti, they found that the sailors left behind at Fort Navidad had been killed in a battle with the Indians after they had roamed the island in gangs looking for gold, taking women and children as slaves for sex and labor. And the chapter goes on to talk about other interactions with the first Europeans as they came to what we now call the Americas. There's a description of Iroquois society. A description of Iroquois culture. No laws and ordinances, sheriffs and constables, judges and juries, or courts or jails, the apparatus of authority in European societies, were to be found in the northeast woodlands prior to European arrival. Yet boundaries of acceptable behavior were firmly set. Through priding themselves on the autonomous individual, the Iroquois maintained a strict sense of right and wrong. He who stole another's food or acted invalorously in war was shamed by his people and ostracized from their company until he atoned for his actions and demonstrated to their satisfaction that he had morally purified himself. Not only the Iroquois, but other Indian tribes behaved the same way. In 1635, Maryland Indians responded to the governor's demand that if any of them killed an Englishman, the guilty one should be delivered up for punishment according to English law. The Indians said, "It is the manner amongst us Indians that if any such accident happen, we do redeem the life of a man that is so slain with 100 arms length of beads, and since you are here strangers and come into our country, you should rather conform yourselves to the customs of our country than impose yours upon us." So Columbus and his successors were not coming into an empty wilderness, but into a world which in some places was as densely populated as Europe itself, where the culture was complex, where human relations were more egalitarian than in Europe, and where the relations among men, women, children, and nature were more beautifully worked out than perhaps any place in the world. They were people without a written language, but with their own laws, their poetry, their history kept in memory and passed on in an oral vocabulary more complex than Europe's, accompanied by song, dance, and ceremonial drama. They paid careful attention to the development of personality, intensity of will, independence and flexibility, passion and potency, to their partnership with one another and with nature. John Collier, an American scholar who lived among Indians in the 1920s and 30s in the American Southwest, said of their spirit, "Could we make it our own, there would be an eternally inexhaustible earth and a forever lasting peace." Perhaps that is some romantic mythology, perhaps there is some romantic mythology in that. But the evidence from European travelers in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, put together recently by an American specialist on Indian life, William Brandon, is overwhelmingly supportive of much of that myth. Even allowing for the imperfection of myths, it is enough to make us question, for that time and ours, the excuse of progress and the annihilation of races, and the telling of history from the standpoint of the conquerors and leaders of Western civilization. Chapter 2 of A People's History of the United States is titled Drawing the Color Line, and it deals with the coming to, again, what we now call America or the United States, of black people from Africa. It begins, a black American writer, J. Saunders Redding, describes the arrival of a ship in North America in the year 1619. Sails furled, flag drooping at her rounded stern, she rode the tide in from the sea. She was a strange ship indeed, by all accounts, a frightening ship, a ship of mystery. Whether she was trader, privateer, or man of war, no one knows. Through her bulwarks, black-mouthed cannon yawned. The flag she flew was Dutch, her crew a motley. Her port of call, an English settlement, Jamestown, in the colony of Virginia. She came, she traded, and shortly thereafter was gone. Perhaps no ship in modern history has carried a more portentous freight. Her cargo, 20 slaves. There's not a country in world history in which racism has been more important for so long a time as the United States. And the problem of the color line, as Weeb Dubois put it, is still with us. So it is more than a purely historical question to ask, how does it start? And an even more urgent question, how might it end? Or to put it differently, is it possible for whites and blacks to live together without hatred? If history can help answer those questions, then the beginnings of slavery in North America, a continent where we can trace the coming of the first whites and the first blacks, might supply at least a few clues. Some historians think those first blacks in Virginia were considered as servants, like the white indentured servants brought from Europe. But the strong possibility is that even if they were listed as servants, a more familiar category to the English, they were viewed as being different from white servants and treated differently, and in fact were slaves. In any case, slavery developed quickly into a regular institution, into the normal labor relation of blacks to whites in the New World. With it developed that special racial feeling, whether hatred or contempt, or pity or patronization, that accompanied the inferior position of blacks in America for the next 350 years. That combination of inferior status and derogatory thought we call racism. Everything in the experience of the first white settlers acted as a pressure for the enslavement of blacks. The Virginians of 1619 were desperate for labor to grow enough food to stay alive. We see now a complex web of historical threads to ensnare blacks for slavery in America. The desperation of starving settlers, the special helplessness of the displaced Africans, the powerful incentive of profit for slave trader and planter, the temptation of superior status for poor whites, the elaborate controls against escape and rebellion, the legal and social punishment of black and white collaboration. The point is that the elements of this web are historical, not natural. That does not mean that they are easily disentangled, dismantled. It means that there is a possibility for something else under historical conditions not yet realized. And one of these conditions would be the elimination of that class exploitation which has made poor whites desperate for small gifts of status and has prevented that unity of black and white necessary for joint rebellion and reconstruction. Around 1700, the Virginia House of Burgesses declared, "The Christian servants in this country, for the most part, consists of the worser sort of the people of Europe. And since such numbers of Irish and other nations have been brought in, of which a great many have been soldiers in the late wars, that according to our present circumstances we can hardly govern them. And if they are fitted with arms and had the opportunity of meeting together by musters, we have just reason to fear they may rise upon us." It was a kind of class consciousness, a class fear. There were things happening in early Virginia and in the other colonies to warrant it.